Hello, my name is Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is Political Science 201, American Government. Now, before we even begin today with the first lecture, let me tell you that I don't teach this course perhaps as many political scientists would teach the course. And there's a very simple reason for that. I am not a political scientist. I have a doctorate in American history, not in political science. And so I plan to teach the course as a historian would teach it. Now, for those of you who are political science majors, do not uh, concern yourself with this. I promise you that we are going to talk in the course of the class. We are going to talk about the important things that a political scientist should know about American government. Um, Fundamentally, I received permission years ago from my department head to teach this course in a non-traditional way. In other words, what we are going to do, we are going to examine each and every word of the United States Constitution. Additionally, we will examine, not in quite so much depth, but we will also examine the other founding documents of our nation, and that includes the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. But with regard to the Constitution, we are going to literally begin with we the people, and we are going to conclude when we cover the last of the 27th Amendment and everything in between. Now, there's a reason I do this. Years ago, when I was first asked to teach this course, I taught it in the more traditional political science way. But I discovered, I noticed that as I was teaching, now the students were there, right? They were awake, they were paying attention, they were taking notes, they were doing everything that they should have done. But when I would mention something about the Constitution, this blank look came over their face. They really didn't know the Constitution the way they should. And so I went to my boss and I asked if I could change it. And he said, sure, sure. As long as you cover the material, sure, go ahead. And so ever since then, I have taught this as an expository, an exposition of uh, the Constitution. Now, before we begin, though, we need to define some terms, and we need to talk about some concepts that you need to be familiar with before we can even begin an examination of these three founding documents. For example, uh, okay, pick up your pen. Here we go. For example, let's define the word government. Um, Government refers to the formal institutions and procedures through which a nation and its people are ruled. Now, some of you are already saying, oh, no, no, this is America. We're not ruled. Uh, Nations that are ruled have a king or an emperor or something. Well, we are ruled, but we're not ruled by a particular person. We are ruled by documents. So, government, in our case, refers to the formal institutions, right? The executive branch, the legislative branch, the uh, judicial branch of our government, through which a nation and its people are ruled. Now, to govern is to rule. Okay, those two terms are uh, have the same meaning. Now, there are certain terms that we quite often use interchangeably that shouldn't be used interchangeably. For example, quite often we use the words democracy and republic interchangeably. Now, it is true that a democracy and a republic have a lot of similarities, but they are not the same. So, if you mean democracy, say democracy. And if you mean a republic, say republic. But in this case, you can use the words government and rule interchangeably. They're the same thing. A government may be really, really simple. There are still primitive peoples in the Amazon rainforest, for example, that we're still discovering down there, right? But even as primitive as they are, literally Stone Age people, as primitive as they have government. It might be as simple as a tribal council that's ruled by a chief or a medicine man. Uh, but it is nevertheless government. Or it might be really complex, which is what we have. We have a very, very complex government here in the United States. It has a lot of rules, it has a lot of bureaucracies. Sometimes it seems that the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. Sometimes it seems that the people who are in charge don't even know the rules. That's the nature of a complex government. The more complex it gets, the more confusing, perhaps, it might be. Now, such complex governments as we have are sometimes referred to as the state. Now, I'm not talking about the state of Louisiana or the state of Texas. I'm talking about another name for a country that has a complex government. We refer to it quite often as the state. Um, Establishing a government is rather easy. Thousands of governments have been created over the millennia. The difficulty is not in creating a government. The difficulty is in creating a government that lasts. More difficult even than that is creating a stable, long lasting government. And even more difficult than that is creating a stable, long lasting government that promotes liberty, equality, and democracy. And I just described our government. Now, there are any number of governments and little nuances, right, that make them different. But if you held a gun to my head and forced me to tell you what are the most common, perhaps, types of government, here's the list that I would give you. It's a list that has 5 parts. Number one on the list would be anarchy. Now, some of you are saying, and you might have a point, that I shouldn't even mention anarchy because anarchy is the lack of a government. It's not a government, it's the lack of a government. And you probably would be right, but let's humor me and let's refer to anarchy as a type of government. In anarchy, no one is in charge. Everybody does what they think is best for them. They don't really think about the needs and the wants and the wishes of others. Anarchy. Anarchy. No one is in charge. Now, another type of government is a democracy. And in a democracy, many people are in charge. A democracy is uh, what we have. Uh, I'm, I'm, I'm recording this video on October the 27th, 2020. And what that means is that next Tuesday, November the 3rd, is election day. By the time you access this video, we will know who the president is going to be for the next 4 years. And I say we because we elect that person. In a democracy, many people are in charge. We each cast a vote. Each of our votes, knows, each of our votes count the same, at least in theory. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But in theory, everybody's vote counts the same. So, what do we have so far? We have anarchy, in which no one is in charge. We have democracy, in which many are in charge. We also have aristocracy. Now, in an aristocracy, only a few people are in charge. Now, sometimes we refer to aristocracies by a different term. Let me give you that. This might be a new term for some of you. It's called an oligarchy. Let me spell that one for you. Oligarchy. In an oligarchy, only a few are in charge, or maybe a few companies are in charge, or maybe the military is in charge. The point is that it's just a few people or a few organizations are actually in charge in an oligarchy. And some nations of the world operate as oligarchies. Fourth type, general type of government is a monarchy. And of course, we know that that is a government that is controlled by a king. Now, there's another term that goes along with monarchy, and it at first glance it seems like it shouldn't be the on the same page as a monarchy, and that's called a dictatorship. But what makes a monarchy and a dictatorship similar? Well, it's very simple. One person is in charge. One person, only one person, is in charge. And number five, there's something called polity. Polity. In a polity is a mix of one or two or more of those items that I just gave you. And honestly, we like to say that here in the United States we have a democracy, but if you really want to be picky and really want to be accurate, what we have is not a democracy, it's a polity. It's a mix of democracy and republicanism. Now, in some nations, the power to govern is held by a single individual, such as a king or a dictator, or a small group of individuals, such as military leaders, wealthy, powerful landowners. In the United States, high tech companies are gaining more and more and more power. Now, they're not governing yet, but they are impacting uh, how our nation is governed. Such systems of government pay very little attention to the desires of the masses of the people. Now, let me repeat that. Monarchies, dictators, oligarchies, such systems of government pay very little attention to the desires of the people. And they tend to hold power by violence or the threat of violence. Such governments are also known as authoritarian governments. Spell that one, and I'll spell these terms as we go because I can't write it on the blackboard, can I? So I'll just spell it as we go. Authoritarian. By the way, one of the neat things about these videos, I mean, there are some shortcomings. I'm not there with you physically, but and that is a shortcoming. I like my face-to-face classes. Pardon me. But one of the strengths of the video class is that students can literally watch these videos as often as they want to. If you're in a class, once I finish the lecture, that lecture is gone forever, right? With this, you can go back, you can watch the whole thing, you can watch portions of it, and I think that that is a real benefit to the video lecture style. Okay, now, an authoritarian government. Let's get back to the nitty gritty. An authoritarian government um, recognizes no formal limits on its power. What an authoritarian government says is we can do what we want to, and we don't really care what the people want or like or prefer. However, in reality, authoritarian governments, there are some limits to what they can do. Quite often, authoritarian governments are restrained. Their power is limited. They are restrained by the power of social institutions, such as the church. You might have a country that has a really ruthless dictator, and he says he can do what he wants to. But the reality is that he cannot do everything he wants to because the church, very often, when I say the church, I'm talking about the Christian church, and more often than not, I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church in nations around the world. The Roman Catholic Church still has a lot of influence and a lot of power, even in nations that are ruled by dictators. So, uh, authoritarian governments, uh, there are limits in what they can do. And another limit, in addition to the church, is the economy. Quite often, um, the government will try to control the economy. It'll be ruled centrally from the capital by one person or by a small group of people. The problem is that the people, right, need to be kept happy. You need to feed them, you need to clothe them, you need to house them. And if the economy gets so weak that the government cannot do those things, it is not unheard of for the people to rise up, rebel, and replace the government with a different government that is more sensitive to the needs of the people. So there are restraints on authoritarian governments, most especially religion and economics. Now, there is another system of government uh, in which the control is even greater than the authoritarian style. And we refer to this as the totalitarian style of government. Totalitarian. Totalitarianism, right? Now, let's say that fast three times. In a totalitarian style of government, the government not only recognizes no formal limits, but there are no formal limits. You see, with an authoritarian government, they say that there are no limits, but there really are. With a with a totality, let me say that again. With an authoritarian style of government, the government says there are no limits, but there really are. In a totalitarian style of government, the government says there are no limits, and they're right. There are no limits to what the government can do. In a totalitarian government, the government seeks to absorb or eliminate the social institutions that might challenge it. Um, Examples? How about Germany under Adolf Hitler in the 1930s and into the 1940s? He was absolute ruler of Germany. How about the Soviet Union, especially under Joseph Stalin? Stalin was the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union. Whatever he said was law. These days, it has become rather chic to speak well of the Soviet Union. I say that that is something that you should avoid. For example, many of you perhaps know this, but some of you don't. During the days of the Soviet Union, especially under Joseph Stalin, more people were killed, murdered, executed by their own government than were killed by German soldiers in World War II. Today, we still have totalitarian governments. North Korea, under the Kim family dynasty. Grandpa started it after the Korean War. His son continued it, and now that crazy guy is still in charge. And it's still the Kim family that is in charge of North Korea, and it is uh, a prime example of current totalitarianism. Now, in contrast, a democracy is a system that permits citizens to play a significant role in the process of government, usually through the election of government officials. Under such a system, under democracy, a constitutional government is quite often the norm. And under constitutional governments, limits are placed on the power of the government. Now, countries that have constitutions, those constitutions vary from country to country. Canada has a constitution, but it's not the same as the constitution that is observed in the United States. But nevertheless, they both have constitutions. They both are constitutional governments. Now, while we're talking about democracy, there's more than one type of democracy. There is a direct democracy, and there is an indirect democracy. Let's deal with this term direct democracy first. In a direct democracy, political decisions and policy decisions are made, as the term implies, are made directly by the people. The people get a voice in what the government should do. Now, there are examples of direct democracy in our country. For example, it's not always been like this, but today, United States senators are elected by the people. Members of the United States House of Representatives are elected directly by the people. So, direct democracy plays a role in our government. But so does that second term, indirect democracy. Let's define it first, and then I'll give you some examples. In an indirect democracy, political and policy decisions are made by representatives of the people. Now, what's a good example of that? Well, I mentioned the U.S. Senate a moment ago as being an example of direct democracy, but that has not always been the case. For many years, as a matter of fact, until the 17th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in the early 20th century, the people did not vote directly for U.S. senators. What happened was that the people in each state, the people in each state elected members of the state legislature. And then the state legislature elected the U.S. senators from that. So the election of U.S. senators has evolved, hasn't it, from indirect democracy, where the legislatures elected the U.S. senators, to direct democracy, where the people vote for U.S. senators. Another good example of direct democracy is the United States House of Representatives. The people elect, specifically by name, the members of the United States House of Representatives. Um, Other examples of indirect democracy, though. How about the United States Supreme Court? We don't go to the polls and vote for a person who's running for the U.S. Supreme Court. No. Members of our United States Supreme Court are chosen not through direct democracy, but through indirect democracy. This is the way it works. We elect the president. Well, we don't really, but for the purposes of illustration, let's say that, and then I'll come back later and correct myself, okay? Pardon me for this itchy nose. We elect the president. Then the president nominates members of the United States Supreme Court. But just because the president nominates someone to be a new United States Supreme Court member doesn't make that person a member yet. He's got to be, because before that can happen, something else that's indirect has to take place. He has to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So it's a step, a series of steps to choose members of the United States Supreme Court. The president has to nominate them. They have to be, but before they can take the job, they have to be confirmed, right? They have to be approved of by the U.S. Senate. It's a really good example of indirect democracy. Now, this term politics is an important term that we need to be very much aware of. In its broadest sense, politics refers to the resolution, the solving, if you will, of conflict between the people. In its broadest sense, it refers to conflicts over the character, membership, and policies of any organization to which people belong. In other words, what I'm telling you is that when we think of politics, we automatically think of the United States government or state government. But politics plays a very important role in any organization that you are of which you become a member. You might join the local Kiwanis Club or the Rotary Club. Politics are involved there in choosing their leaders, in deciding the policies of the organization, of deciding, what kind of fundraiser are we going to have, and where is it going to take place, and when is it going to take place. Those are, if you think about it carefully, those are all political decisions. Politics, in its broadest sense, is the resolution of conflict, the resolution of disagreement. Now, a system of government in which the people select representatives who then play a significant role in government decision making is usually called representative government. We don't personally travel to Washington, D.C., to the Capitol to vote on all of these issues, do we? No. What we do is we elect people to go to Washington, D.C. to make those decisions. So, first of all, it's indirect democracy, isn't it? We don't personally do it ourselves. We elect people that we depend on to make the right decision. But that's also, not only is that called indirect democracy, but it's also called representative government. Now, there is another name for representative government that you hear quite often, and that descriptive term is a republic. Now, what is a republic? Well, a republic is a political system, politics, right? The resolution of conflict. It is a political system in which there are several steps. In the first step, the people themselves elect people to represent them, right? We choose U.S. senators and send them to Washington. We choose U.S. representatives and send them to Washington. That's the first step of the Republican process. So the first step is the election of people to represent us. The second part of the process is the people that we choose to represent us then make the laws. What is the third step? We promise to obey the laws that are created by our representatives. So it's a three-step process. We choose, and when I say representatives, I'm using the lowercase r, not the uppercase R is a reference to members of the United States House of Representatives. But the lowercase r is just someone who stands in our stead. He is our representative. Right? The first step is we choose our representatives. The second step is the representatives now create the laws. And the third step is we agree to obey the laws that are created by the people that we had chosen to begin with. And in very simple terms, that is how a republic operates. Now, on the national level, the United States is a representative democracy, a republic. The citizens select government officials, but they do not vote on the legislation. But, but some states, there are some states where the people actually do vote on legislation. And that is a process called initiative, referendum, and recall. Now, let me spell all of those terms. Initiative, Initiative. The second term is referendum, Referdum. And recall, of course, Recall. How does initiative, referendum, and recall work? Well, let's assume for just a moment. Let's play what if. What if, by the way, playing what if is always fun. It never settles anything because it's hypothetical, but it's fun to play what if. What if Lincoln had not been assassinated? What if the United States had won the Vietnam War? Right? What if? What if Louisiana, let's pick on Louisiana, that's where we are. What if Louisiana had elected a governor? He was a fine fellow, right? He was handsome, he was smart, he was rich, he was a great communicator, he really loved the people. He sounded like a perfect guy, right, to be the governor. So the people of Louisiana elect him. But once he takes office, it doesn't take long for the people of Louisiana to realize that he's bit off more than he can chew. He's really not up to the task of being governor. That happens quite often. All of you probably know somebody who was a high school football player. They were a star. Nobody could stop them. But when they got to college, they sort of fizzled out, right? They were as good as they were ever going to get in high school. Well, some people are like that when they go into government. They might have been really great as a city councilman or as a mayor, but when they're chosen to be the governor, they're out of their element. Okay, so that's what has happened here. The guy has done nothing wrong, has he? He's just out of his element. Now, normally, as a citizen of Louisiana, what would you have to do to replace that guy? Now, if he had done something wrong, you could impeach him, right? And we'll talk about that later. You could impeach him and kick him out of office. But he's done nothing wrong. So how do you get rid of him? You use the initiative, referendum, and recall method of doing this. It's a three-step process to get rid of somebody who, for example, is incompetent. Oh, by the way, you can use this to get rid of laws too. Now, I'm going to use a ridiculous example to make my point about a bad law, okay? Let's assume that the legislature of the state of Louisiana passed a law making cannibalism mandatory, right? Don't know why they did it, but they did it. Uh, if you don't have initiative, referendum, and recall, there's nothing you can do about it except chow down on your neighbor, right? Oh, yeah. But if you have a method by which you can remove the law, then you can get rid of that ridiculous law. So, initiative, referendum, and recall are used to not only get rid of people, but to get rid of laws that the people don't like. Right. Here's the process. It's got to happen in this order. First of all, the initiative has to happen. Now, the initiative is a fancy word that simply means petition. What you would do, you would develop, you would create a petition, and in the petition, you would say, I am a registered voter in the state of Louisiana, and I favor getting rid of our incompetent governor. And the petition is passed around all over the state. If people agree with it, they sign it. And when enough people sign it, you go to the next step. Now, let me tell you this. A number of states have initiative, referendum, and recall. But the rules vary from state to state. For example, in one state might require 60% of the registered voters to sign the petition. Another state right next door might require 75%. The next state over might only require 40. So it varies from state to state, but the process is the same, right? You pass around the petition. The petition is very clear about what the goal of the petition is. And when you get the number of votes that is required by your state, then the next step in the process kicks in, and it's called the referendum. And the referendum simply is a fancy Latin word that means the vote. So when enough people sign the petition to get rid of the governor, that creates an election, and the goal of the election is to either keep the governor or to kick the governor out. The referendum. Now, let's assume that we've conducted the initiative, right? We've done the petition. We've also held the election in which we are going to either get rid of or we're going to keep the governor. But let's assume, for the purpose of illustration, that The people of Louisiana vote to get rid of the government. What's the next step? It's the recall. Recall simply means kicking that guy out of office. Or in the case, if this was a law, doing away with the law. So initiative, referendum, and recall. That's the process, and it must be done in that order. Now, not all states have initiative, referendum, and recall. I've been using Louisiana as an example of this, and I probably shouldn't have done that because Louisiana does not have initiative, referendum, and recall, but other states do. California, for example, the state legislature can pass a law, and if the people don't like it, they can go through the process of initiative, referendum, and recall, and they can wipe that law off the books. Or, now here's a real life example. This happened in California some years ago. The people of California elected a governor. His name was Gray Davis. And from all accounts, Gray Davis was a good, moral man. But he was in over his head. He was elected governor, and it very soon became apparent that he really had no clue how to be the governor. And so the initiative, referendum, and recall process was started in California. They collected the proper number of signatures on the petition. The election was done properly, and the people of California voted to kick him out. And that's exactly what they did. By the way, as a result of that election, Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor of California. The governor. We don't have that here in Louisiana. It's been suggested, but it's been defeated in the legislature. Someday, maybe, someday. Now, there is no initiative, referendum, and recall at the national level. If you want to get rid of uh, a U.S. senator or a member of the U.S. House of Representatives or the president, um, you can't use initiative, referendum, and recall to do it. You can use the impeachment, and we'll talk about that later, right? But impeachment is pretty much the only way that you can get rid of somebody who is already in office. Now, you know that the United States is a very diverse society. Uh, Americans come from all parts of the world. Americans share, I'm sorry, they don't share, Americans exhibit very different political ideas, right? Um, but we do share certain common characteristics, and that is what makes us all Americans. Now, there is no blood test that can be given to you that will determine whether or not you're an American, right? You can take a blood test that will determine whether you're male or female. You can take a blood test that can determine whether you are Asian or African or European, right? But there's no blood test to prove or disprove that you are an American. There are no biological characteristics that you can look at a person and say, oh, yeah, he's an American. I can look at him, I can look at his physical characteristics, and I know that he's an American. Doesn't exist. What makes us unique, what makes us truly American, is something called our political culture. Our political culture. Political culture is defined as the deep seated beliefs of a particular people. The deep seated beliefs of a particular people. So, what makes us Americans hinges on our values, not on our biological makeup. Now, Americans love to debate what some of those values are that makes us uniquely American. I'm going to give you a list. Uh, I'm not saying that this is the complete list, but I am saying that everything that's on this list probably is a characteristic of what an American is. And by the way, these are the characteristics that most Americans agree with. Now, not all Americans agree, but most Americans agree. Okay, here's the list. There are 6 items on this list. The first, and you can label this things we mostly agree with. Okay? Things we mostly agree with. First thing that we mostly agree with is liberty. So let's define liberty. And I'm going to repeat these. Okay? The principle, plus you can always go back and watch the video again. Right? Okay. Liberty is the principle that individuals should be free to act and think as they choose, provided that the way they act and the way they think does not infringe unreasonably on the rights and freedoms of others. Once again, liberty is the principle that individuals should be free to act and think as they choose, provided that they do not infringe unreasonably on the rights and freedoms of others. Number 2, equality. Here's something else that most Americans agree with. Equality. Equality is the notion that all individuals are equal in their moral worth, in their treatment under the law, and in their political voice. Nobody is more important than the guy next door, right? We all have we're equal in our moral worth. We might have more money, right? We might have more fame. We might have all, but as individuals, every individual is worth the same. Also, in America, we are equal in our treatment under the law. Now, that is not always, can we just be honest here for a moment? That's not always been the case. Today, there is no law for a white man and a different law for a black man. There's no law today for a a man and a separate law for a woman. There is not a law for a gay person and a separate law for a straight person. My point is that we have equal treatment under the law. Now, that's not always been the case, has it? Absolutely not. My specialty is Black history. So I know, and hopefully you know also, that there was a time when Black people were not even considered to be human. And as a result, the laws that were on the books were there for the benefit of whites, not blacks. Women, even though women on paper had their citizenship, women did not receive the full rights of citizenship until the early 20th century. And if you were gay, well, that's a battle that's still being fought, isn't it? That has not really been settled. On paper, gays have equal uh, rights under the law. But in reality, that has still not been settled by many Americans. And in their political voice, that's the third part of this. Uh, you cannot be you cannot be deprived the vote based on your gender, your race, your sexual orientation, right? Your wealth. None of that stuff matters. If you are a citizen of the United States, and you register to vote according to the laws of the state in which you live, you cannot be deprived of your political voice. You cannot be deprived of the right to vote. Okay, so let me repeat that. Equality is the notion that all individuals are equal in their moral worth, in their treatment under the law, and in their political voice. Now, number three is the idea of popular consent. Now, the word popular has its roots in Latin. Uh, POP generally refers to the people. When you see any word, pretty much any word that starts with the letters POP, uh, it has something to do with the people. Popular, right? Populist. Popular consent is the idea that the people are the ultimate source of governing authority because it is the people who choose our officials. We sometimes choose them through direct democracy, and we sometimes choose them through indirect democracy. But one way or another, the people have a voice. They are the ultimate source of governing authority. Now, fourth, unity. Unity is the principle that Americans are one people and form an indivisible union. Now, oh, itchy nose. We've already established, haven't we, that there's no such thing as a biological American. Um, what makes us unique is our political culture. But unity is an important part of that political culture. Unity is the principle that Americans are one people and form an indivisible union. It doesn't matter. Sometimes it seems like our nation is being torn apart by divisiveness and political differences and all those things. But the bottom line is that when it becomes necessary for Americans to pull together to accomplish a common goal, Americans are uh, among the most unified people in the world. I remember when I was a kid, my brother and I, we fought like cats and dogs. It was our favorite activity, just fighting all the time. Drove my mama crazy. But I also remember that when my brother and I were threatened by somebody from outside the family, look, we would put our backs back to back and we would take on everybody. You know, somebody tried to mess with my brother, I was on him. Somebody tried to mess with me, he was on him. We were unified, even though you couldn't tell it on a normal day. Another of these characteristics is diversity. Now, we just talked about unity. It seems like diversity is the opposite of unity. Well, it sounds like it is, but not really. So let's define diversity. Diversity is the idea that individual and group differences should be respected and are a source of national strength. Let me do that again. Diversity is the principle that individual and group differences should be respected and are a source of national strength. Put it in modern terms, the things that make us different are the things that make us strong. The things that make us different are the things that make us strong. And the last of these characteristics is individualism, which seems like it's in direct opposition to the idea of unity and diversity. So let's talk about individualism for just a moment. Because a lot of political scientists, and I'm not one, but a lot of political scientists say that perhaps individualism is the most important of these characteristics that make us uniquely American. Americans believe that the individual is the source of all rights. Americans have an intense commitment to personal initiative, self sufficiency, and personal property. Many scholars believe that liberty and self government grow out of individualism. It's individualism seems like it's at odds with itself sometimes. I like to use an example from the frontier days. A man and his wife and his kids would load up the covered wagon and they would head west because it's getting too crowded in Kentucky or in Tennessee, right? They want to go to the Rocky Mountains or something. And they're willing to take the risk of doing that because of their individualism. They don't want to be a part of a crowd. They want to do things that they want to do, and they want to do it the way they want to do it. And so they get to Colorado. And they together build a log cabin, right? And they together clear the land, and together they plow and plant and reap. But sometimes there are things that they simply cannot do for themselves, and it requires the help of a neighbor. How about a barn? It's hard enough to build a log cabin, right? How about building a log barn? Big structure, right? Well, the way it was done back in those days, they would have what was called a barn raising. All the neighbors would gather together. Now, neighbors might live 5 miles apart, right? But nevertheless, the word would get out that Mr. Smith needs help raising the barn. And so on a particular day, normally on a Saturday, everybody in the neighborhood would get together, men and women and children, and they would all go to his farm and they would cut the logs and they would put them together. And by the time the day was over, they pretty much had a new barn built. And it also became a time for socialization. While the men were working, the women were cooking, and they would have a feast, right? Baptists would call it dinner on the ground. So you can see in that one story, there's rugged individualism. In other words, they're willing to leave everything that's precious to them and strike out on their own in order to be able to do things the way they want to do things. But every once in a while, they run across a situation where their independence doesn't solve the problem. They need the help of people, and in those cases, they are more than willing to accept that help. So, uh, let me read that definition one more time. Individualism. Americans believe that the individual is the source of all rights. Americans have an here it is. Americans have an intense commitment to personal, right, initiative, self-sufficiency. I can do this by myself. Don't need your help. And personal property. That's my land. You stay off my land. Don't you put that fence over on my yard. But at the same time, liberty and self government stem from individualism. And at the same time, Americans are willing to not only ask for help, but to accept help as well. And that's a good place to stop. That's 1 hour right there. That's 59 minutes and 16 seconds. All right. So that was lecture number one. I'm going to stop it and we will pick up and continue this train of thought in video lecture number two. And I'll see you soon.